Greetings programs, welcome to my latest books video, and for this one I've gone back to what is quite possibly one of my favourite books. It's a book I've read a whole bunch of times, although it's been a couple of years since the last time, and I quite deliberately picked it out after going through the Hydrogen Sonata as a thing I wanted to read, partly because I hadn't read it for a while, and also partly I just wanted an excuse to eulogise one of my favourite books. Now, there's always like a risk with doing something like this because it's like I can't pick just one favourite book, but if I had a list, if I was absolutely forced to make a list, this book would be on it. But the thing is, of course, there's always that risk when you really love something that not everybody is going to feel quite the same way. So bear that in mind while I'm being massively, gushingly enthusiastic about it. Of course, it's not necessarily going to be everyone's cup of tea, but as for me, I think it's brilliant. Now, the book in question is Stand on Zanzibar by John Brunner, and this was published in 1968, so we're going back a few years. It won a Hugo Award, which might tell you something, and it is really quite, I don't know where to start almost. There's just so much to say about this, or at least there is for me. It's interesting and it's different for a couple of reasons. Now, a big one for me, and I think just a big one generally, and possibly one of the reasons why it won the Hugo, was it has a very interesting narrative structure. It's told in a way that not a lot of authors have attempted. Now, it's not the only novel that's told in this way. There are a couple of others. And indeed, it was probably influenced by an American author called John Dos Esos, who wrote a number of books, including a kind of trilogy in one volume, if you like, called the USA Trilogy. And that was broken up into, it had... I've not read it myself, but I've read a little about it. It was broken up into like different flavors of chapters. So some were narrative chapters, some were chapters that were giving information in the form of newspaper clippings or bits from magazines or whatever, and some chapters were like little biographies of people. And it was all slotted together in a way that kind of built up this mosaic pattern that all drove the story forward. And that's pretty much how Stand on Zanzibar is structured. You've got different kind of types of chapters. So you've got some narrative chapters which drive the story forward and unfold important events, and then you've got a lot of other chapters that are kind of sitting to the side almost, but they're also giving us a lot of information about the world. And it can be there's one or two things that are presented in the form of like news clippings, and there's chapters where it's literally like columns of information about various countries in the world. There's still other chapters where it's literally like mashed up like advertising slogans. It's all very the whole thing is quite, what's the best way to put it? It's fractal in a way. The whole idea of this mosaic structure, like it's quite fundamental to how the story is told and the kind of information it gives you. And even with the narrative chapters, there's like two main strands. There's two main protagonists and two main strands of story. And there's also a lot of what you'd still call narrative chapters, but they're set aside from that. And sometimes they bring in characters that we maybe only, they get mentioned once or twice throughout the book. But it all builds up this picture of the world that this book is set in. Now, the world it is set in is the world of 2010 as seen from 1968. And it's not... I don't think Brunner sat down and went, right, okay, this is how the world is going to be in 2010. I think he sat down and with a whole lot of different influences and a whole mass of information inside of his head, he went, this is a world that could exist in 2010. And it's actually, it's a very 60s vision of the future in some ways, but in other ways, there's a lot of stuff that is surprisingly very relevant today. There's some predictions, you might call them, that are almost bang on the money. And there's other stuff that's just like is not, a world we would recognise at all. This 2010, for instance, is a future in which personal computing does not exist as a concept. Now, bear in mind, this book was written in 1968, and computing was very much the province of large mainframes and supercomputers, and networking as an idea existed, but the notion that you would have a computer in your home that would, be able to do all the stuff that modern PCs can do was probably quite a far removed one, and it's not one that a lot of science fiction of that era really, not a lot of authors made that prediction. So there's all this kind of stuff that builds up, and it's one of these books that it's almost like a kaleidoscope. You can look at it in different ways. You can kind of shift it slightly and get a different pattern, and shift it slightly and get a different pattern. And you can look at it in one way, and you could see it as a tragedy and a comedy. The two main characters are called Donald Hogan and Norman House. And they actually, they're kind of initially, they're sharing an apartment at the start of the story, and then at the end of the story they're brought back together again, and they're almost two very different people. So you might see it as the tragedy of Donald Hogan and the comedy of Norman House, or you might see it as he's trying to give it this pattern the story after a strand of DNA. You've got these two strands that are kind of running parallel to each other with all the little chemical markers that make up the information that makes DNA. And I use DNA as a very specific thing, because a very big part of the world of 2010 that's in this book is to do with genetics and genetic optimization. This is a future in which eugenic legislation is completely commonplace, and that might seem like a completely nonsensical idea to us in this day and age. But actually, there were countries, even countries within Europe, within, I think, Scandinavia specifically. I think Denmark did, and I can't remember if Sweden did or not as well, but they actually had eugenic laws. And they, forcibly sterilized people that the state deemed to be unfit to reproduce, which, again, in this modern day and age, it seems crazy to us. But that was, he took just so many ideas together into this book, and so many bits of information about his world in 1968, and he kind of drew them out and extrapolated and produced this wonderful mosaic. Now, there are, I don't know what to talk about next, really. It does have some flaws. It's not perfect by any means. Like I said, it does feel like a very kind of 60s vision, and the way he's done it, it's very it's a vibrant world, it's a noisy world, but it is also, because of that fragmented nature of the narrative, the way the chapters are broken up, I think one of the weaknesses of this book is actually the characters themselves, because it introduces a lot of minor characters that it brings in to try and enunciate various facets of this 2010 that he's created, but it means that even though we still get a lot of the two main characters, because there's so many kind of minor characters, you don't really get that much time to build up an appreciation or a relationship, it might be a better way to put it, of those two main characters. They're not particularly either of them likable people. This is not a book that you read because you really get to associate with the main characters in the book. There are some books that you will sit down and it's the nature of the characterization that draws you in. You start to root for somebody, and it's actually one of the harder things to do in fiction is to write a novel with a really unlikable main character, and it has been done, but it's really difficult to do well, and there are very few authors who have successfully done it well. So it's not the characters that keep you going in this. The characters are almost agents of the world in which they live, if that makes any sense. It probably doesn't, but they are sort of part and parcel of this vision of 2010. You're not really reading to find out what happens to them. You're reading to find out what happens to the world around them. It's this vision of the future and the way in which it's told that really keeps the whole thing going. And it's just so well done, and it must have taken so much effort to write that I don't know. It seems almost astounding that somebody did sit down and write this. Now there is one thing I wanted to talk about, and I was actually going to start off talking about it towards the beginning of the video, but it's always the nature of these things that I get carried away. It's a bit flow of a stream of consciousness, these videos, in the way that I do them, but I still try and remember to hit all the points I wanted to hit. And, well, the point I wanted to try and hit in this case is that, in my mind, I always see it as there being like two strands of science fiction. And this, I mean, it is science fiction, but you could also argue in a way that it's speculative fiction, except I wouldn't even really call it that. But basically, you've got the kind of hard scientific technical tradition of Jules Verne, and then you've got the more kind of sociologically focused tradition of H.G. Wells. Now, Verne was very much, here is the science I know, and I'm going to sit down and work out numbers. You know, what kind of explosive force would it take to propel a giant shell to the moon, for instance? And he wasn't that far off, actually, although, of course, these days we know that building a gun big enough, you know, in the case of From the Earth to the Moon, the occupants of such a shell would not survive. It would not work. But he tried to, you know, extrapolate from the technology of his day. How would we get into space? How would we reach the moon? And the notion of, you know, rocketry, liquid-filled rockets, would have been as foreign to him as the notion of possibly personal computing was to John Brunner in 1968. Wells, on the other hand, even in, I think, well, not even in just is what we'd call science fiction these days, but just in all of his novels, he was really interested in exploring how like various societal situations would change human behavior. And it's a lot more subtle in things like The History of Mr. Polly, for instance. But then you look at other books like the Time Machine, or The War in the Air, or maybe one of his more satirical ones, Tono Bungay, where he just kind of deconstructs almost. He kind of constructs these situations and then deconstructs the kind of human reactions to it. And this is very much in that tradition. Now, of course, a lot of sci-fi just, you know, falls in the gaps, or not in the gaps, but it falls in between those two polar extremes. But this is very firmly at the Wellesian end of the scale. This is all about, this overcrowded Earth where people are overly concerned or overly obsessed with their own kind of genetics and with their fellow man, and the kind of this sense of tension and competition that's just absolutely endemic practically everywhere on the Earth. He kind of throws all this in and then uses the focus on individual characters to explore what that would mean on an individual level. So that's kind of what I mean when I'm talking about the characterization isn't actually that strong for the most part, because it's more about how would people react rather than here are these characters I want you to care about, if that makes any sense. Now, another criticism I could make, having come back to characters has reminded me, there's another thing I want to talk about, and it definitely is a criticism, is that like a lot of sci-fi from this era, the cast of characters is, or the important characters anyway, it's predominantly male, and it didn't have to be. And it's not maybe specifically a criticism of this book such as it is of like new wave science fiction in general. If you had female characters, they tended to be far less important, or they were there to kind of like serve the needs of the male characters in some way. I don't mean how that sounded, but from a narrative standpoint anyway, you know, they were there to get kidnapped, or they were there to have somebody to explain stuff to, or whatever. They weren't there as like characters in their own right. There is kind of one semi-important female character in this. One of the strands concerns this big, powerful corporation, General Technics, and Norman House, one of the two main characters, is actually a vice president for General Technics. Now, the founder of General Technics is a woman named Georgette Talon Buckfast, and everyone refers to her as Old GT, but she only actually appears in a couple of chapters. So though arguably she's a sort of, you know, of the supporting cast of characters, she's one of the more important ones, she's not really in it. You don't really get to know about her. And of the other female characters that are there, they're not particularly important. And we don't ever at any point... well, actually, no, I was going to say we don't ever at any point get to see anything through the point of view of one of the female characters. But no, I think there's one of the very, very minor characters, one of the characters that's used in a couple of the sections that, you know, has all this world building in it. We generally, like, it's an overwhelmingly kind of male-centric book, and maybe it sounds like I should be typing all this up angrily and putting it on Tumblr, I don't know, but it's definitely there. It's not hard to notice, and it might just be that, I don't know, a lot of authors of this period just didn't want to attempt it, but I don't know. I think if you're a good enough author, it doesn't matter. I mean, the lead character of the Hydrogen Sonata was a female character, and I think it... I don't know. I mean, I really have no particular explanation as to why John Brunner in particular didn't in this case. But having read one other of his books, it didn't really have any particularly like important central female characters either. So there you go. That's just an observation. Otherwise, though, I mean, there's just so much about this book to love. I mean, there is actually another character that I'm going to talk about briefly, and it's I mentioned that, you know, he didn't really predict in any way the rise of personal computing, and to be fair, that didn't really happen until decades after this book was actually written. But he does sort of, like, computers are still an important strand. They're an important part of this future, and there's a kind of a whole one of the sub themes going through it is about sort of how would I put it, self-determination, I guess, man's self-determination, and how some of the characters, like, they feel that's being undermined, because this is an era in which powerful supercomputers exist, and governments and corporations don't tend to take decisions without first extensively running it through computers, seeing what the results are, seeing what predictions of various scenarios would be. And the one that's most prominently featured, in fact the one that you might almost say is actually a character, is meant to be a character, almost a character that never speaks, except they kind of do speak at one point, is the computer of General Technics that's called Shalmaneser. Now, this is a name of an ancient Assyrian king. And what Shalmaneser is a supercomputer. Supposedly one that is actually capable of thought, of consciousness. And this is actually another strand of the book that kind of underlies... well, actually, the whole book, it's actually quite an important one in some ways, but it's subtle, whether or not Shalmaneser is truly conscious or not. And that kind of... well, I can't really say too much, actually. It would be a spoiler, and I'm trying to keep these spoiler-free. But Shalmaneser is important, suffice it to say. And actually, the chapter I'm going to read out it's actually about halfway through the book. It's almost exactly halfway through the book. And it is... his introduction to Shalmaneser. It's Brunner's kind of explanation, finally, because there's a lot of this book that he kind of feeds in little bits of information here and there, and you have to kind of figure it out via inference, via context what it is that it's meant to be, and it kind of explains little bits here and there as it goes along. And actually, there's another thing that I wanted to talk about, but I'll talk about it after after I've read this chapter. So there's a bit at the start that's kind of broken up rather, and this is actually there's a lot of this book that it really only works as words on a page. When I was reading the chapter from Banks, and I was thinking about this a bit afterwards actually, there are some authors, and I think Banks is one of them, where you can sit and read it out loud and it has a good flow to it. The words are on the page in such a way that you can sit and you can read them out, and it's not difficult. They are written in a way where it almost seems as if, the intention was that they could be either spoken or written, and it would pass the same way. It would make sense. This is a book in which the words are written down in a way that I cannot imagine somebody trying to do an audiobook version of this, because the way he uses words on the page, it's incredibly visual at times, and this is it's almost a part of the book that this is it's like what's his face that wrote Watchmen and V for Vendetta, and like he has famously said that he thinks there are certain stories, or he tries to tell stories that he thinks can only be told in the visual medium, in comics. And he was therefore a bit unhappy when they adapted Watchmen to be a film, for instance, because it was always his intention that should exist in that one form. That was how that story was meant to be told. This is like that with books. Some books are like that. They exist in the form of words on the page, and it's that physical fact that they are words on a page is very important, and it would be very difficult to actually transfer that to another medium. And this is one of those books. It would be very difficult to adapt this for TV, for instance. Anyway, that was another point I wanted to get out of the way, but this is, it kind of leads into reading this chapter. So this is Tracking with Close-Ups, chapter 17, and he actually broke the different strands. He's got 4 different strands, and Tracking with Close-Ups is it's the one. It's one of the ones that kind of gives more detail of the world. So the chapter heading is Brighter Than 1,000 Men, and it starts off with actually a couple of limericks. So here we go. Shal pizzle teaser, had a wife and couldn't please her. Go and tell the big computer Mary's lover doesn't suit her. Children's singing game reported from Syracuse, New York, November 2009. A randy young wench named Teresa tried her charms out upon Shalmanisa. For the first time quite frigid, she, not he, grew rigid, and the scientists couldn't unfreeze her. Graffiti from the University Hall of Residence, Auckland, New Zealand. Variants common throughout the English-speaking world. They surely are condemned to hell, who rule their lives by greed and lust, and Satan waits for those as well who in machines repose their trust. Hymn composed for the 10th International Rally for the Family of the Divine Daughters, who are like this fundamentalist, Christian organisation. Anyway, this is one of the really visual bits. I wish codders I had cool detachment like. Chilled, child, chilled. How are you felium in the liquid helium? Here we go round the Hungary flush. Meg, a brain computer, shall man ease her, or would you advise against it? Don't. From Graunch, Provos, Persix. Yeah, I don't know. I think it's supposed to be lyrics or something. I'm giving my own notes here, but I feel like I have to. It's that kind of a thing. Like, how that's laid out up on the page, there's no way to get that across verbally. It is dismaying, one may even say disheartening, to see the degree to which blind faith in the manufactured objects that we dignify by the name of computer has replaced trust in prayer and the guidance of God. You will never find anyone to admit that he or she has substituted a machine for the living divine presence. Yet that is exactly what has happened to the bulk of our population. They speak of the evaluations which computers print out for them in the hushed, reverent tones which our ancestors reserved for Holy Writ, and now that General Technics has made its arrogant claim about this new piece of hardware, nicknamed Shalmanisa, we can foresee the day when everyone will have surrendered his responsibility as a thinking being to a machine which he has deluded into respecting as more intelligent than himself. That is, unless we, with God's help, manage to reverse the trend. From an earlier sermon by the luckless bishop whom Henry Butcher sabotaged. There's a lot of this as well, like it'll link back and forth to earlier chapters, so that is not one but two earlier of these little linking chapters that references. That makes no sense to you. Like, you don't have those pieces of the mosaic, but once you do, that just means something a little bit more. Okay, Shal, you tell me what I ought to do. Colloquial usage throughout North America. Shal, that real cool piece of hardware up at the GT Tower. They say he's apt to evolve to true consciousness one day. Also, they say he's as intelligent as 1,000 of us put together, which isn't really saying much, because when you put 1,000 of us together, look how stupidly we behave. The Hip Crime Vocab by Chad C. Mulligan, and he's another fairly important minor character. He's a sociologist who provides commentary that kind of is fairly expository, but it's not particularly even. It's not particularly even at all. Anyway, that's also one of my minor criticisms, is that the bits with Chad C. Mulligan in, like, sometimes they're quite clever and smart, and other times it's like, well, that just fell flat. Anyway, onto the chapter proper. Never in human history did any manufactured object enter so rapidly into the common awareness of mankind as Shalmaneser did when they took the security wraps off. Adaptation of him as a public image for prose and verse followed literally within days. A few months saw him apotheosized as a byword, a keyword in dirty jokes, a court of final appeal, and a sort of mechanized messias. Some of these cross-referred. In particular, there was a story of the about the same Teresa who cropped up in the New Zealand limerick, which told how they sent for a Jewish telepath to ask what happened when they discovered that thanks to the liquid helium she was in a state of suspended animation, and he explained with a puzzled look that he could only detect one thought in her head: Messias has not yet come. It's a bit dirty. Also, until GT published a rota and scale of higher charges, consultant computing firms in 20 countries trembled on the verge of bankruptcy as their clients decided to switch their custom to Shalmaneser. Mr. and Mrs. Everywhere had been shown visiting Shalmaneser 137 times, more than was accorded to any other activity except free fly shooting. Orbiting on Triptine, Benny Noakes was prouder of the fact that his imagination had produced Shalmaneser than he was of any other event he had dreamed up. Factually, he was a I always get that word muddled in my head, micryogenic device of the family collectively referred to as the Thekapex group. Theoretical capacity exceeds. Human brain, understood. And of that family's fourth generation, his predecessors having been the pilot-modelled Jeroboam, the commercially available Rehoboam, of which over 1,000 were in operation, and the breadboard layout Nebuchadnezzar, which turned out to have so many bugs that they discontinued the project and cannibalized the parts. The number of technical problems which had to be solved before he could be put into operation beggared description. The final program for the schematics required 14 hours continuous operation of 6 Rehoboams linked in series, a capacity which the publicity department calculated would be adequate to provide a 1,000-year solution for the orbits of the solar system corrected to 20 decimal places. And at that, using so much capacity for so long on a single task brought the chance of a 6-fold simultaneous error to the 30% level. So there was one chance in 3 that when they built the final version and switched it on, something would have gone irredeemably wrong. Indeed, some of the original design team had recently been heard to express the heretical view that something had gone wrong with the schematics. By this time, they claimed, it should have been established beyond doubt that Shalmaneser was conscious in the human sense, possessed of an ego, a personality, and a will. Others, more sanguine, declared that proof of such awareness already existed and evidenced certain quite unforeseen reactions the machine had displayed in solving complex tasks. The psychologists, calling to settle the argument, left again with headshakes. divided into two equally opposed camps. Some said the problem was insoluble and referred back to the ancient puzzle. Given a room divided in two by an opaque curtain and a voice coming from the other side, how do you discover whether the voice belongs to a cleverly programmed computer or a human being? Their rivals maintained that in their eagerness to see mechanical consciousness, the designers had set up a self-fulfilling prophecy, had in effect programmed the schematic so as to give the impression of consciousness when information was processed in the system. The public at large was quite unconcerned about the debate between the experts. For them, Shal was a legend, a myth, a folk hero, and a celebrity. With all that, he didn't need to be conscious as well. A few days after they rigged up the direct verbal inputs, Shal was the first computer ever with sufficient spare capacity to handle normal spoken English regardless of the speaker's tone of voice. One of the technicians asked him on the spur of the moment, "Shal, what's your view? Are you, or are you not, a conscious entity?" The problem took so long to analyse, a record 3/4 of a minute, that the inquirer was growing alarmed when the response emerged. "It appears impossible for you to determine whether the answer I give to that question is true or false. If I reply affirmatively, there does not seem to be any method whereby you can ascertain the accuracy of the statement by referring to external events." Relieved to have been given such a disappointing answer after the worrying delay, the questioner said flippantly, "So who do we ask if you can't tell us? God?" "If you can contact him," Shal said, "of course." And then it ends with another limerick even. "The case of Teresa's instructive. It shows how extremely seductive a shiggy can be if her anatomy is first rendered superconductive." Quoted in the General Technics House Organ, January 2010. So, I mean, that's one of the more kind of broken up chapters. Most of the chapters, some of them have those like snippets of information, others are just solid narrative, but that one's kind of a mix in between the two. And it's interesting that it takes half the book to get there, to get this solid explanation. I mean, you learn very rapidly what Shalmaneser is, and that just kind of expounds upon it and just gives us more detail. And it really is, this is a book all about the fine detail of the world around it, and it's almost like a painting in words in some way. It's just, there's a narrative to it and there's a flow to it, but interspersed with that there's all this just tiny little bits of stuff, these ones and zeros if you like, that tell you so much more than if this had just been a straight narrative story. And I think that's one of the reasons I like this book so much, is it's just so different from so many of the other books that I've ever read. It has its flaws, sure, but at the same time it's a book that I just keep coming back to. And I mean, like most books, it's like most, narratives, it's kind of, it's a journey, essentially. It's a journey through the story, but the way in which you take that journey is just so markedly different from so many other books that I've read. And it's always interesting coming back as well. I mean, this is another aspect in which it's a journey. I mean, when you read a book for the first time, or when you travel somewhere for the first time, it's a very different experience than retreading a familiar path, especially if it's I don't know, let's say for the sake of argument, a really scenic route where you really like the view, this is the equivalent in book form if you like. It's a very different experience, and so coming back to it, even though I know what's going to happen, it's still it's satisfying. But there's nothing that can quite replace that feeling of having read it the first time, of turning the page and not knowing what you're going to find or where the story's going to go. And the ending especially. I mean, this is another reason why I love it. It is in some ways, this is possibly a minor spoiler, it is in some ways, maybe it could be argued, the best Shaggy Dog story that's ever been written. But also at the same time, it's not. It's got almost like a proper ending, and then it's got the kind of the Shaggy Dog ending. And I can't really explain what I mean by that, because it would massively, like, one of the joys of this is actually remembering my reaction upon first getting to that final chapter and reading that final. It's tiny. It's like a paragraph and a half. There's not much to it, and yet it just kind of like, it's just so perfect. And it's one of those rare things where I wish I could just like wipe my memory of this book and go back and read it again for the first time, and just every time I reread it to have it be the first time somehow, just because getting for the proper first time to that ending, I had to go and like just sit down afterwards. It's the literary equivalent of somebody telling you a really fantastic, brilliant, but awful pun. That's probably the best way I can put it. That just the ending is just like the cherry on top of an already excellent cake. Or it would be if I didn't like, if I did like cherries, which I don't. So that was a terrible analogy from a personal point of view. But yeah, it's just the whole thing. It's just so marvelously put together. Now there was, I think there was one. Yeah, there was one other thing. There was one last thing that I'm going to talk about. That I'm going to cover, and then I'm going to wrap this up. And this is going to have been a really long video compared to my other books videos. But as this is one of my favourite books, I think that's absolutely fine. And if you've made it this far, then well done. So the final thing I want to talk about is the language. And one of the things you gather very early on is, in fact, it's in it basically quotes, and I'll read out the quote. I'll read another bit. This is chapter 0, the Innis mode. There is nothing willful or arbitrary about the Innis mode of expression. Were it to be translated into perspective prose, it would not only require huge space, but the insight into modes of interplay among forms of organisation would also be lost. Innis sacrificed points of view and prestige to his sense of the urgent need for insight. A point of view can be a dangerous luxury when substituted for insight and understanding. As Innis got more insight, he abandoned any mere point of view with his presentation of knowledge. When he interrelates the development of the steam press with the consolidation of the vernaculars and the rise of nationalism and revolution, he's not reporting anybody's point of view, least of all his own. He's setting up a mosaic configuration or galaxy for insight. Innis makes no effort to spell out the interrelations between the components in his galaxy. He offers no consumer packages in his later work, but only do-it-yourself kits. Now this is a quote from the Gutenberg Galaxy, which is an academic work by Canadian language and communications theorist Marshall McLuhan, and the Innis he references is actually another Canadian academic who wrote earlier, and they are like there's literally a name for it, the Toronto School of Communication, and it's a whole school of thought on communication and language theory. And Brunner was clearly influenced by this. I mean, he lays it out, that mosaic pattern that is absolutely the genus for this book. It is like fundamental to it. So he's clearly, he's read around, he's read about language theory, he's got interest in language and communications and the development of language, the shifts that take place. And there's a lot of new words in this. He invents a lot of slang in particular, and most of the time it's like it's not particularly drastic. It's mostly a drop-in of slang words, so you can figure out from the context by what he means. For instance, he like shiggy and codder just mean female and male, but they're kind of slang terms with like very informal connotations, and the connotations kind of vary on the circumstances in which they're uttered. But there's a whole there's a whole language like that. There's a whole kind of slew of like new words. Like he treats language as a living thing, and it's interesting because you've also got some of these the snapshots I was talking about earlier with like minor characters that you maybe only see once or twice that are there to give detail to the world. Some of those are kind of older characters, and he doesn't treat society as this kind of monolithic thing. You've got people, like a couple of times he mentions, people of older generations who find it difficult in a variety of ways to adapt to, the way the world has changed. He doesn't, you'll find it with a lot of books that characters, like, they don't, there's no kind of, they don't acknowledge generational shifts. They don't acknowledge shifts in language. Like Star Trek, for instance, it's hundreds and hundreds of years in the future, and of course it's just I can see almost that everybody's still speaking perfect, English as intelligible English to us anyway today. And then of course there's the fact that everybody looks like people with Mars bars stuck to their foreheads, as the joke goes. But it's very. That's another thing that not a lot of books, not a lot of authors are brave enough to do, is to sit down and go, well, language is fluid, and this is set decades from now. And he would absolutely have been aware of the fact that even within, like, you could speak to somebody 100 years ago and you would be able to, like, in English, and you'd be able to understand them. I'm not talking about shifts like from modern English to back to, say, the Middle English of Chaucer. But even within, say, language from 100 years ago to today, there's a shift in usage. There's a shift in patterns. Words take on different meanings, or slang words particularly kind of rise and fall all the time, and there would be even just like a shift in speaking patterns, and it's not even just within a language, but it can be within a geography as well. It can change from place to place, and that's another thing that this book acknowledges, which is absolutely bang on, because English is one of the world's most spoken languages, but it's wide enough and fragmented enough that it's now English in different places is kind of, they're almost moving apart from each other, if that makes any sense. So someone that speaks like Singaporean English would have maybe a set of words and a style of speaking that would seem strange to somebody that speaks British English, for instance. And it's a book that absolutely acknowledges that. So I just see this as a book that, Brunner wrote a lot of books before this. He had a very, like the 60s were a very active time for Brunner. He not a lot of those books are especially regarded today. And then I just feel like there's a lot of stuff. He's obviously been reading and accumulating all these thoughts and all this knowledge and all this information about the world and information about language and genetics and computers, and there's just so much in here, and it just all kind of combined together in this fantastic explosion of ideas. And it's, like I said, it's vibrant and it's noisy and it's dirty, and it's got such fine detail, and it's just wonderful. And there's a reason it's one of my favourite books, and there's a reason it won a Hugo Award, among others. So I think I should probably wrap this up here. I've been talking for, good grief, well over half an hour now. Stand on Zanzibar. You should read it. I think it's fantastic, and it is absolutely one of my favourite sci-fi books of all time. Just one of my favourite books of all time. And I think it's one of the best sci-fi books ever written. Maybe not the best. I would be very, very hard-pressed to pick out a personal favourite in that regard. But it's fantastic. And I think even if you only read it once in a lifetime, just reading it once and getting through to that ending, like if you get it, if you get the book, if you enjoy it, if you didn't find the excessively kind of visual mode of writing to be off-putting, then I think once you get to that final chapter, it'll blow your socks off, because it's just wonderful. Anyway, I think that's enough rambling for now. This has gone on longer than I intended, but given that I love this book so much, maybe it's not so surprising. Hopefully you found this video interesting and you've found my thoughts on Stand on Zanzibar interesting. Go and get a copy from your library today. You won't regret it, at least I hope. If, however, you're in the position of that you have read it already, well, I will be very interested to hear your thoughts below, so don't hesitate to give them. Otherwise, you can hit that like button. If you approve of what I'm doing here, you can leave any other miscellaneous assorted thoughts and comments below. You can sub to the channel or go look at my gaming channel if you are new to either. And, as always, stay tuned for more.